Seasonic, the heart of your system.
Ladies and gentlemen, today's review is this Fractal Design Meshify S2. We need to raise the drama and tension a notch, so Soundman, give us a roll of the snare drum. Video editor, prepare to start rolling clips of previous reviews, because you, unless you have not previously seen, let's get this straight, the Meshify C, which was an ATX case, the Meshify C Mini, which was micro ATX, the Define R6, which was the eATX with a kind of blank front panel and the option of putting an optical drive or moving the components around internally, or the Define S2, which is the water cooling version with everything opened out, and now they've put a mesh front panel on to create the Meshify S2. So this case has one heck of a lot of history behind it, but realistically, once I pull out this bottom dust filter, put my fingers up there and release that panel, this review is about this piece of case right here. Before I crack on with a build in this case, a very quick recap. You can put 3 fans in the front, 3 in the top, 2 in the floor, 1 at the rear. They can be 120s or 140s. Radiators is not quite as simple as multiply by 3, so you can, and I'll read from the numbers to make sure I get this completely correct, 360 in the front, 280 in the front, 360 in the roof, 420 in the roof, 120 or 240 in the bottom, 140 or 280 in the bottom. The bottom, I don't like putting radiators down there personally, and up at the rear, if you really want, you can put a small radiator there. So that's 280 front, 420 roof, 360, 360. In other words, heaps of cooling. Now, as I said, the difference between the R6, which comes with the drive plates out here, and then you can, if you choose, move them backwards to open the case up. With the S2, that's already done. Pull off this side panel, and I'll spin it round to show you the storage, which is here. These 3 caddies there. We've also got a couple of SSD mounts, and you can, if you choose, take off this glass panel. Just realised I haven't yet removed that. You can, if you choose, mount the SSD sleds on the power supply cover, should you choose. The stock fans, you've got 2 Fractal 140s at the front, 1 Fractal 140 at the rear, and although this is obviously a white case, clearly, it's that peculiar Fractal white where it's actually a combination of black and white. They love doing that. If I just push that button there, the top panel, which is black, comes loose. And that gives you this radiator mounting plate, so you can quite easily remove that plate, install a rad on it, drop it into place. Makes life easier. Obviously, if you're using hard tubing or indeed a custom loop, once it's installed, that is then going to be fixed in place by the tubing, either hard or soft. So it's useful when you're building a system, but once it's built, it's essentially fixed in place. Other than that, it's all familiar. We've got a PWM hub here on the back, and to my mind, that PWM hub kind of sums up this case in that we've seen this hub now from Fractal for, I think, 2 years off the top of my head, and whereas Phanteks has modified their hub and they've come up with a sort of strip which goes along the top here and takes up very little space, in this instance you'll note the hub is there and that EPS grommet is there. So if you're trailing your power supply cables up here, they will go directly over the PWM hub. Not the end of the world, not by a long chalk, but the fact is this case hasn't really evolved dramatically internally because the core chassis has been around now for quite some time. As I say, this Meshify S2 is identical to the S2 apart from the mesh front panel. It's also worth pointing out that the I/O panel there has 2 USB 3s and 1 Type-C. When I first did the Define R6, from memory that had 4 USB 3 Type-A's, and then they came up with an updated I/O panel, which I actually have installed in my own personal version of the R6, which had a Type-C. So back in the days of R6, well, back R6 is current, when the R6 launched, was the cusp of changing from all Type-A's to a combination of Type-A and Type-C. This continues that theme. So there we go, that's the briefest of brief rundowns on the Meshify S2, and now it's time to put some guts inside the system. System built, white case, bit of RGB, all looks very pretty. You will note I've arranged it on the table such that the Meshify front panel is strategically on view, just to remind you it's all about the Meshify part. And now I'm going to turn it so we can forget about the mesh just for the moment, and we will talk about other things. Take off this main panel. Uses the ball and cup mechanism that Fractal's used a few times. Components I've used for this build, they've all been chosen for a reason. So the motherboard is a Asus ROG Rampage 6 Extreme. That's an eATX board, deliberately done just to see how well this case supports eATX, as that's part of the specification. The answer is you have to feed your power supply cables through before you put the board in, because essentially the board covers the grommets. No surprise, if it was any other way you'd have a very big case and you have the grommets to the outboard, and with an eATX that would look peculiar in its own way. We've seen this a number of times. So this is nominally eATX, however my view is you're better sticking to ATX. The power supply is a Seasonic Snow Silence 750 watt titanium because it's a white power supply, white case, so it looks aesthetically pleasing. Processor Core i9-7920X from Intel. It's a 12 core 24 thread high-end desktop, 2.9 gigahertz all cores. Memories from Corsair, it's their SE, it's white and illuminated white, not RGB. Chosen, quite frankly, apart from the fact it's rather nice memory because it looks good in this installation. Cooler, similarly chosen, it's from GamerStorm, the brand of deep cool. Captain 360X White RGB. RGB because this case does not have any RGB, and frankly it needs a bit of a lift aesthetically. You've got the black and the white, bit of RGB, and it starts to look quite good. Graphics card is a reference Nvidia RTX 2080 Founders Edition with the stock cooler in the stock location. If you choose to use the vertical mounts and you have to buy a PCI Express riser cable, you're going to basically suffer from airflow problems in my opinion, because the cooler is pretty much up against the glass of the side panel. That's not good. Phanteks with their Eclipse P600 has essentially a triple slot system going on, so you can put your dual slot card one slot away from the case. In this instance it's fairly hard up against the glass. That's not so great, particularly in a case where the front panel is about airflow. So my recommendation would be, either if you're going down the vertical graphics card route, liquid cool it. If you're going air cooled, stick to this layout and all will be well. So the GamerStorm cooler has 3 fans in the front. I've moved the 2 stock front fans into the roof, and I've left the stock fan in the rear. So the cooling layout is not as per, however it's entirely reasonable and logical. So we have 6 fans on the go. And cooling is absolutely fine. Before I get to cooling, however, a few details about the installation I think about it. So the 360 cooler, to install that, I've removed this hatch here, which sits ordinarily there. 2 screws out it comes, that's easy. Fractal includes some accessory SATA power cables, because if you're putting 2.5-inch SATA SSDs up the back, you might need to give your cables a bit of helping hand, which I think is a good idea. I didn't need them because I've used a single M.2 SSD as a Samsung 960 Pro. That's on board, hence it's essentially invisible. If you're using extra drives, depending on whether you're putting them there or up the back, you may need to help your power supply out. Accessory box, very neat and tidy, standard Fractal stuff. So there you have a little listing of what you get, so you can actually identify the components easily. And there you get the bag, because I've barely used any of those. Nonetheless, that's all good stuff. So in terms of the cooling, I've left the fans running in normal mode, so they're not running super duper loud. They're running as you can hear them now, which is basically barely at all, but it's not silent mode. And I did thermals for the CPU and GPU with the case in this configuration, and then I removed the front Meshify panel and replaced the stock air filter at the bottom, which means you've got quite clearly a decent airflow path, and with the glass panel on this is obviously. And then I did a bit of science, and I removed the front panel, which as I say is tethered by cables, and I went back to the Define S2 that I previously reviewed, and I lifted this front panel like so, and I put this front panel on like so. And this is part of the reason why I've got the case turned sideways on like I have. Because when I pop that on, like so. And with the S2 panel installed, you can see the intakes on this side, it's exactly symmetrical on the other side. That looks to be quite restrictive compared to this Meshify front panel. Exactly the same situation with the Define R6. And yet the fact is it barely hurts performance whatsoever. Just as you would expect, the Meshify front panel does indeed help airflow. But we're talking in the territory of 2 to maybe 4 degrees. I say that because the ambient temperature in this room crept up over the few hours when I was doing my airflow and thermal tests. So the ambient gradually creeps up, and the thing is it's kind of a localized thing. It's the air around the case I'm particularly interested in. So temperatures of the internals of the case as I switched from the Meshify front panel to the S2 front panel certainly crept up by 2 degrees. The room temperature on the other hand was also changing very slightly, so it's hard to be precise. But the mesh does help, but not by a massive amount. Certainly not when you're talking about a stock clocked CPU. And we've had this any number of times. If you run CPUs within standard parameters, they'll run all day long, particularly with a whacking great big 360 cooler like that. When you start pushing the overclock, it can be a different story. But overclocking a 12-core high-end desktop processor, again, that's heading to the outer limits. So the thermals work perfectly well, but to my mind, the mesh front panel is mainly about aesthetics. It's got a certain rugged chunkiness about it. So if you switch over, you'll gain a benefit, but the benefit is fairly tiny. I am slightly surprised to note that there's also been this change in the front I/O, such it's now on the front panel, rather, because otherwise you'd think it'd be the easiest thing in the world for Fractal to offer an alternate front panel so you could switch your S2 or R6 over to a Meshify. As it stands with the I/O being like that, it wouldn't work, because if you bought this panel, it wouldn't go on because it means there's a slight incompatibility. I'd much prefer it if this was simply an accessory for existing owners. And you can buy the R6, which is the one that you can move the parts around, as I said previously, internally, so you can have the optical drive bay and you can have loads of storage, or you can move the components to open up the internals, which makes it essentially an S2. And then you have the S2, or you can make it a Meshify by changing the front panel, and lo and behold. So essentially Fractal has trickled out different versions of this case over the year, little bit in a year. I'm trying to think when the R6 came out. I think it was Christmas a year back. So R6 S2, Meshify S2. And they're really milking it for all it's worth. Now, that's not a stupid thing to do, not by a long chalk. Fractal, very sensible people. But the upshot is, you're looking at this going, well, I mean, there's no great inspiration required to put a Meshify front panel. Bearing in mind Meshify, they've had that's a year or two now. So they've obviously just decided, let's just freshen it up a little bit with another option. But the core chassis remains the same, and the core chassis is not exciting. It's not bad, it's just not exciting. This is what I said about the S2. Everything I said about the S2, which was, it was really nice a year and a half back, and now it's like, it's now just okay. I'm going to say their name again, it's Phanteks. Phanteks keeps pushing design forward, and I'm very pleased they do. And when you have a core chassis that's literally sat still apart from the front I/O, it means that Fractal is kind of, relatively speaking, moving backwards, because this is not innovation, it's just a nice little tweak. So I'm very happy seeing the Meshify front panel, but I cannot get excited about it. If you're an extreme overclocker and you need the max airflow, okay, fine, no problem whatsoever. On the other hand, if you're an extreme overclocker, you might be concerned about that huge glass panel and the fact that the rear panel has no sound deadening, and the thing could get a bit rackety. You know, it's a bit of a balancing act, because the airflow through this case, it's not exactly subtle and sophisticated. In the front, out the top, out the back, wallop. But nonetheless. So all my, they weren't complaints about the S2, quibbles, yeah, that'd be a more correct word. My quibbles about the S2, which was it was looking a little bit stale. Yep, all of that still applies, and now it's got the option of a mesh front panel, which is nice. It would be really good if Fractal was to include some RGB. I think the time has come for them to nail their colours to the mast. Be Quiet doesn't do RGB, but they do quiet. Everybody else does RGB. Fractal is not working to make their cases particularly quiet, and they're not going for the bling of the RGB. They're going for a sort of middle of the road position, and as a result they're sort of being a little bit left behind. It's time for Fractal, I think, to up the game. I want the next case from Fractal to be something that really makes me go, wow. This case is not the one that makes me go, wow. It's like, it's mesh. That's all right. I can either buy that case or this case for exactly the same price. I just choose which front panel I want. Okay, it's an aesthetic thing. It's almost exactly the same as choosing a different colour. So thank you very much, Fractal, I appreciate it, but I'm not excited. Congratulations, you've got to the end of the video, so hit the bell button, we'll tell you about new videos as they become available. If you're not subscribed, do subscribe. Head over to Kit Guru, you'll see more photos of this case, you'll be able to see the details, which it looks okay in video, but it looks better in photos. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget that, we like thumbs up. I'm Leo Waldock, this is the Fractal Design Meshify S2.